This afternoon's event marks the opening of our exhibition in the Tower, Kerry James Marshall. The show is the sixth in the Tower series, which focuses on late 20th century and contemporary art. Previous exhibitions have featured the works of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Philip Guston, Nam June Paik, and Mel Bochner. We're very honored to show the work in this program of Kerry James Marshall. The idea of the exhibition developed from the acquisition of Marshall's seminal painting, Great America, by the Collectors Committee of the National Gallery in 2011. The show presents the sequence of remarkable works that precede and follow from this painting, affording a context for understanding the work and its complex imagery. A depiction of four passengers in a boat exiting an amusement park tunnel of love. Great America recalls the memory of the Middle Passage, the crossing of slave ships from West Africa to the Americas, in a contemporary scene. In Marshall's art, the past is never past. History exerts a constant pressure on the living. The exhibition has been made possible through the generosity of Carl and Michael Sachs and Dr. Anita Blanchard and Martin Nesbitt. Additional support has come from the Tower Project of the National Gallery. We're also extremely grateful to the lenders and institutions who have shared their works, and especially to Kerry James Marshall for his assistance in realizing every aspect of the exhibition and for making these great works. And now to the event, a discussion of the exhibition by Kerry James Marshall and the show's curator, James Meyer. Gentlemen.
I too want to thank our sponsors, Carrie and Michael Sachs and Anita Blanchard and Martin Nesbitt, and the members of our Tower Project. I hope you're happy with the show. And I want to thank as well the members of our staff who also made it possible. Rusty Powell, Frank Kelly, Harry Cooper, Mark Lighthouser, Jamie Anderson, Gordon Anson, John Olson, Lahua Fisher, Chris Myers, Christina Del Sesto, Lynn Matheny, Wendy Battolino, Fayakazi Ali Pell, Lisa Farrell, Jenny Ritchie, Dan Randall, Frank Adams, Paige Rosansky, Noriko Bell, Carolyn Weaver, Don Henderson, and Brad Ireland. And I also want to thank Dana Rice. I want to mention a few events that we're organizing around Kerry's show, including a film series that's going to happen organized by our Department of Cinema. We have a series of 3 films called Kerry James Marshall Selects. Kerry curated this sequence. Over Labor Day weekend, it will be a Labor Day weekend blowout. They are Michael Romer, Nothing But a Man, August 31st, Marcel Camus, Black Orpheus, December 1st, and Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, September 2nd, for which Kerry James was the art director. And in the fall, we will bring 2 filmmakers whose work is germane for the exhibition. Kevin Jerome Everson will show his film St. Matthews and Fifeville on October 19th, and Andrew Do's Sunmu, Restless City, will be on November 23rd. And we also hope to have one more discussion with Kerry in the fall with a distinguished group of panelists that will enlarge upon our discussion today. So Kerry, getting to you, the last time you were here, I recall that you referred to me from this stage and you described me as a smooth-talking used car salesman. Do you remember that?
I remember that well.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you do.
Yeah.
You still remember it.
I remember it very well, and just to continue your metaphor of the car dealership, I just wanted to mention that I'm in the driver's seat this afternoon. I'm asking the questions, and I assure you they'll be very smooth. As Rusty suggested, this show came about when we acquired, through the generosity of Collectors Committee, Kerry's picture, Great America, in 2011. And this precipitated the show. The Tower, as you know, is a special space in the tower of the East Building. The series of Tower shows was conceived by my colleague, Harry Cooper, and it presents a particular challenge to the curator. how do you shape a kind of coherent show that will unfold a complex story in that beautiful space? You can't provide a whole retrospective of an artist, but you can provide a slice of his or her work, a deep understanding of something about the artist. So this show I conceived is a Great America sequence. It presents a series of works by Cary over the years that relate to this work that we acquired. And I want to stress that it's a site-specific show, and by that I mean I really conceived it for this space, for this institution, for this tower. And I believe, due to Cary's gifts, we have a sweep of American history when you walk upstairs, presented in a 360-degree fashion. If you look around the room, you have this sequence of works. And I just show you upstairs what we have. Beginning with Baptist, 1992, Gulf Stream on the right, Voyager, Great America in the middle, Plunge. On the right wall, Our Town, Bang, two of Cary's house-eaten pictures we'll talk about. And then, as you face the entrance, these two maquettes for Cary's frescoes that he made at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which we'll discuss. And last but not least, the small side gallery, where we presented a sequence of drawings that will reveal to you how Cary works, how he developed the ideas for Great America, and works throughout the show. And at the end, the painting Nat Turner with the head of his master, which we'll discuss. So Cary's show poses the challenge of how do you represent the unrepresentable? How does an artist begin to depict the Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangular trade of human cargo, of material manufactured goods and crops that transpired between the colonies, Europe and Africa for centuries? And what is the reverberation of this history in the present? This is the ship Wanderer, the last documented slave ship. And Cary, of course, made this work, Voyager, at the Corcoran. And as you see on the side, it says, Wanderer. So this is the challenge that Cary posed in this work. And he's not the first artist to deal with this subject matter. Predecessors we all know include Romare Bearden and Aaron Douglas. But the question is how did Cary go about it? So that's my question for you, Cary. How do you represent this Middle Passage in your work?
Best way to start describing how I think about what the Middle Passage represents is that it really is it's a point of transition. It's a place in which a sort of massive change takes place. And it's a place that is also, I mean, it's almost like the way the myth of the Bermuda Triangle kind of operates, where there's this zone in which you enter this zone and essentially fall off the face of the earth as the person or the culture or the identity that you were, and then and are somehow lost. I mean, it's a place where things are lost. Where identity is lost, where culture is lost, where history is lost, where your past is lost. That's sort of what the Middle Passage represents. And because it represents such a tremendous loss, it exists as a kind of space of incomprehensibility. And so when you're trying to, as James had, I think, mentioned before, trying to represent the unrepresentable, trying to depict the the undepictable, let's say, but it's a place of how do you make something out of nothing, in a way, but it's a nothingness that exerts a really powerful influence on the way you are able to understand yourself and the way you exist in the moment that you occupy at your own moment, because it's in part. I mean, the challenge, the existential challenge is really to understand from where you came. And if the if access to that kind of information that might locate you somewhere is unavailable, then you have to somehow either imagine it, or you either have to reconstruct it out of other kinds of materials that may in fact have nothing at all to do with the thing the thing that you're trying to represent, or figure out some kind of way to imagine it. But the problem with imagining a thing that has such great trauma associated with it is that you don't want to be consumed by the idea of its trauma. So then you have to try to find some ways to represent this thing that are mediated by a more complex set of relationships. Because the thing is, with the idea of slavery, the problem with slavery for a lot of folks, and for me, I would say it's the case as well, is that we began with a vague idea of what the implications of the idea of slavery are. So, and because we don't study history in the kind of depth that's required to really begin to come to terms with it, we tend to skim across the surface of it. And the surface of the narrative of slavery presents you with two competing existential realities. One is that it's an unimaginable trauma that cannot be resolved under any circumstances. And the other is that it's a kind of a rebirth into a space in which you are able to fully realize your humanity as an individual out of a past that didn't contain any of the possibilities that you're able to experience now. And so there are these two narratives for black folks. Either we are supposed to be grateful for having been brought here, for having our ancestors having been brought here, because if not for that, we wouldn't be able to enjoy things like Great American Amusement Park. Or you're constantly trying to contest the reality of African American existence by never allowing anybody within the culture, American culture at large, to forget that we arrived at this moment out of an incredibly brutal, violent, and traumatic past. So these are the two poles that I think we're always wrestling with, and we all sort of operate somewhere in between in this sort of narrative. And so what I'm always trying to do, I think, is to represent the thing in between. I mean, so the metaphor of the Middle Passage actually functions in a lot of different ways. Not only do I represent the Middle Passage as a kind of historical phenomena, but even here, it's like it's the middle way to try and come to terms with what the Middle Passage represents. So that's sort of how I see it.
So many of the images are maritime images. It's in a way a maritime show, and the sea represents journey and passage and a middle point. The painting Baptist, you have this figure between the two continents. So transition and
right, and it's not also, and even in a picture like this, I mean, these things I think are fairly obvious, and I think when people see it, then you will automatically recognize the implications of some of these things. So in a picture like the Baptist, not only is the figure sort of located on the map between the space of these continents, but if you look at the way the body of the figure is constructed, there's a dislocation in terms of the two parts of the body. So the body is truncated, it's cut off from itself because of the refraction of the way the water, it's like if you looked at somebody's body halfway through the water in a swimming pool, you would see that a part of the body seems to be disconnected from the other part of the body. But that dislocation is actually a really important metaphor as well.
as are the crosses that recur in our painting. Let's see. Several paintings have these red crosses, and so one could think of it as the Red Cross state of emergency, but also, as you've suggested, a kind of transition.
Yeah, because I mean, for people who are familiar with the Yoruba religion and or Haitian Vodun or Santeria in Cuba and Candomblé in South America, I mean, there's a pantheon of African gods or deities or mythological characters that are represented by a certain set of symbols. And one in particular is a figure called Eshu Elegba, Eshu or Elegba. And that figure corresponds in Greek and Roman mythology to Hermes or to Mercury, who is the messenger. and functions in the Yoruba tradition and in Haiti as a kind of intermediary. He's the deity one has to evoke in order to get access to the other higher powers, to the higher gods. And he's also sort of seen in the United States as the trickster. So the Brer Rabbit character would be Eshu Elegba in American culture. And so it's the trickster god. He's the one who, if not dealt with respect ahead of time, will upset all of your stuff. He's like, he will mess you up completely. And so the Red Cross in there represents all of those things. Yes, the state of emergency as it's referenced by the Red Cross, but also it's an intersection. It's a place of exchange. It's a crossroads, which is what Eshu Elegba represents.
And you have markers of African religion and myth, as well as Christian. That old-time religion is good enough.
Give me that old-time religion.
Yeah, so that's the that's a gospel song, right?
Right, and that's a gospel song, but it refers back again to the African religions as a kind of old-time religion too. And so if you take those Yoruba-based religions in Haiti and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, I mean, this desire to hold on to or to continue to practice religions that are based in religious practices that have an African source, this is also a part of that old-time religion thing.
And you put these markers of voodoo, these what they're called veves, in some of these paintings. If you look, everyone, they recur in several of these works.
Yeah, and this is in part to make it clear on some level that, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't give enough thought or credit to, is that, I mean, a lot of the people who were brought to the Western Hemisphere as slaves, these were grown people, a lot of them. There were a lot of children as well, but they were grown people, so they had something. They had life experiences. They were involved in religious societies. They were involved in different aspects of whatever their own culture was. So they brought that with them when they came. They didn't come with nothing. And so this notion that Africans came as slaves with no history, no culture, they came empty-handed and empty-headed, is completely out of the pocket, to use a phrase, to turn a phrase. So they had something when they arrived, and many of them, as most of us do, when you're trying to reorient yourself to a place that's unfamiliar, to experiences that are not like anything you'd had before, what are the things you use to help reorient yourself? You reorient yourself by using whatever you have left over from the culture and the history that you've already internalized. And because a lot of Africans from a lot of different tribes ended up in the same place, they mixed all that stuff up together amongst themselves, but they put it together, they cobbled it together so they could at least begin to kind of reformulate or reshape some experiences that were more familiar to them. So this is why in Haiti, Vodun exists the way it does. This is why in Cuba, Santeria exists the way it does. This is why in Brazil, those religious practices exist the way they do. And they exist that way embedded in the Catholic religion and Christian religion because they were forbidden to practice these religions freely on their own. And so they found a way to mask the fact that they were still practicing these sort of forbidden, what people would have called pagan, primitive sort of religions. But they did that by using the Christian saints and Christian gods as stand-ins for the gods in the Yoruba pantheon.
But just to get back to the question of this representation of that subject matter and thinking about your work within a history of African American art. So I just thought it'd be fun to look at Aaron Douglas's Into Bondage from the 30s next to your Voyager. They're both here in DC at the Corcoran. And of course, Aaron Douglas sets up a real narrative of people being enchained and on the land. And as you look outwards, you're looking toward the ships and the sun and the west, and you're being brought out there. So he sets up, through perspectival kind of depth, this narrative of voyage from one point of view, telling a kind of story. How would we think about your approach? What is the Kerry James Marshall approach in terms of representation? How do you frame it as a painter? You're not setting up a narrative in the same way, it seems.
Not in the same sense. I think you could more properly think of mine as an evocation of a certain kind of experience and a certain sense of that history. Because there's the things that are clear from the outset. It's like, well, what don't I do? Well, what I don't do is I don't show black people in chains. I don't show people praying for hope, or I don't, it's like the upraised arms and things like that. I don't show black people doing that kind of thing. And that's a difference between, I think, the way I've approached the idea of the Middle Passage and the way I think when you talked about Beard and you talked about Aaron Douglas, the way other artists have more conventionally thought about representing the experience of slavery is that it's really easy to do that familiar conventional thing where you show people in chains or being beaten or being whipped or being otherwise brutalized. We know that already, and we see a lot of images that are like that. And those images, you can sort of take them for what they are at face value. But I think because they're so familiar, people quickly turn away from those images, and I think they let people off the hook.
So they lose a kind of effectiveness.
So they lose a little bit of their potency because they become, that notion of what slavery is becomes such a kind of cliche and kind of a commonplace. Now, mind you, it was all of those things. It was as brutal as might be suggested. But there's a way in which the fact that people are wearing chains doesn't necessarily amplify the traumatic experience they might be going through, because there's actually something quite I don't know. There's no tension in that work for me, in a sense. It's like it's not. There's an implied kind of drama and an implied kind of horror, but it's represented in such a kind of stable and kind of calm and kind of static way that it loses some of the potency, I think. And so what I tend to do is try to set up a meditative space in which you're able to think about a lot of things that are part of the outcome of the slave trade, as opposed to the kind of process of enslaving.
So they're not history paintings in a more traditional sense. The image of that moment, it's about a reverberation.
Yeah, they're an image about a moment in history. They're an image about a period in time. They're images sort of, they don't depict a particular event. They don't depict the action necessarily. They're almost always about either the anticipation of the moment or the contemplation of the moment after the fact.
So the temporality is different.
So completely different.
And it's interesting looking at Voyager and the word wander on the prow. And so it's not a depiction of that ship from which we just saw an illustration. It's not Wander itself.
Right.
The last ship, 1858, landed in Jekyll Island, Georgia. 80 people died on that ship.
Yeah, there were 500 captives on that ship at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, so
it's more synecdochal. That is to say, it's a part for the whole. This little skiff
absolutely
represents the kind of totality of it, in a sense.
Absolutely. But it also says there's a way in which that picture kind of sets up a series of relationships between the two figures in the boat as well. Because so there's a female figure in the prow, and then there's a male figure behind that sail. And there's something about the distance between those two figures that is also a consequence of the experience of the Atlantic slave trade. And it has something to do with it says something, in the way I set it up metaphorically, about the capacity to regenerate oneself and one's own culture as a result of this experience as well. So when I structure things, I'm thinking about all of those kinds of qualifications in the work. So
Because there's images of fetuses, right? A
Right,
kind
so-
of birth image, and this house could be
There's-
confinement, it could be a lot of things.
Right. There's a home. I mean, it's a constellation of things that in their totality add up to a series of relationships across time, and I think fundamentally talk about being and becoming.
Just to show everyone, this is a sample of some of the drawings upstairs that allow us to see how Cary developed Great America. We've got pretty much all the drawings upstairs for this painting. And what I found, there's so many fascinating things one could point to, but that he starts off with the single boat and images of what it is to fall in the water, to drown. And of course, many people were thrown overboard after they died on the boat, or they committed suicide. All kinds of horrible events happened. But then, of course, the development's rather complex. Suddenly, Cary's putting in 2 boats. You're getting these sorts of volleyball or water polo players. Suddenly, Hart's Tunnel of Love. Here's that image again. Well, I could go on and on. Isn't this a Noah's Ark, kind of abstract, suprematist Noah's Ark on the left?
Was going to be
Yes.
for something else I was working on.
And Cary wanted to cut this drawing up because he said, "Oh, I'll just cut that up for you." And I said, "Absolutely not. This is so interesting. 3 ideas on 1 page, including this well-dressed guy who we might connect to that fellow in Cary's painting, Terra Incognita, the 20s, 30s cruise ship waiter with the Red Cross, the Yoruban Red Cross image. And then Cary said, well, actually, that gentleman it relates, but is not exactly the waiter, and that he's perhaps a contemporary businessman. But all these sorts of connections can be made if you look at the show.
And then it goes, so if you take those, in this Terra Incognita painting, which is, it sort of gives you some insight into how I approach things too. So those coordinates around the frame up there, those are the longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of the middle of that triangular section in the Atlantic that's called the middle, frames the Middle Passage. That's where it is located on the compass dial on the map. So.
And then, of course, you ended up with the last drawing and some kind of Yoruban designs or voodoo designs on the boat. And that generates the picture, although you cut it down further, didn't you? You gave us 4 figures in the boat as opposed to 5.
As opposed to 5.
And you put somebody overboard with a head.
So you end up with the manifestation of the very first idea of the picture with the figure in the water, with the man's head with the head over in the corner of the picture. So, because this is where I started when I wanted to make a picture about the Middle Passage. You know, of course, the first thing you imagine is the classical, conventional idea. It's like, well, this is what that looked like. It's like if I had been one of those figures on the boat who had gone overboard and was sort of sinking down to the bottom, and I looked up, I would see a stream of other figures sort of coming down to join me. And so that's really how I started. But you know, it's when you're making a painting, you're making a picture that has to exist over a longer period of time, and it's an object that you want people to be able to come back to again and again and again, and each time they come back to it have the access to more and more and more information, and then a deeper and deeper and deeper understanding of what the picture's trying to do. You would find that a picture like that is just too simple. I mean, too simplistic in a way. So it may hit you really hard, like in the very beginning, but it's not something that you're inclined to come back to time and time again. And what you want to make as an artist is a work that has what another artist told me once was, one of my professors, was a long reading time. You know, a work that doesn't sort of immediately give it all up. It's like at the first encounter, But if you, just at a glance, sometimes if you're passing by it, you notice something that you didn't quite notice before. You see a relationship between things that you didn't quite understand before, and then you start to piece it together. Because the other thing is, like, even though the paintings may not seem so obvious in the beginning, I'm actually not trying to be cryptic. I mean, I'm really not trying to make things that are incomprehensible. I think I'm being crystal clear when I'm making those things, and I'm selecting the images and the objects that I put in there and the relationships that I make between them. I'm selecting those things because I think they clarify more than obscure the things that I'm trying to make the work about.
But they're not didactic.
No, they're not didactic.
That would be the work that you see and you get it and you move on. I mean, wanting to move forward to Plunge and to works in the show where we're starting to move from the imagination of the transatlantic crossing to the suburbs. And as many of you know, Kerry James has painted several images of houses, housing images. They're called mainly of public assistance housing. But we are showing 3 works that take us to the suburbs. And it was this work, Plunge, that plunged me into the suburban aspect of Kerry's art. The fact that we've got this pool, a backyard, but then we notice Atlantic Ocean, we notice a kind of ship, and we notice those Haitian vevets and somebody underwater, and then it starts to sort of relate to Great America.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, you see, it's like the whole idea of the Middle Passage and slavery, that stuff is inescapable. I can't get away from it. I mean, it's a recurring challenge that may never be fully resolved. So I come back to it again and again to try and find another way to kind of flesh out some other aspect of how I think about that, and then what I think of the implications of it for the contemporary moment.
In Plunge and in the studies we have, including this beautiful drawing of a diver, the body is isolated. You're really focusing on the body and the water. We're not in a boat, we're actually coming into the water and plunging and going into it. In this one, it looked like you had a public pool at some point, lanes and several swimmers, and yet you went, in the end, to the suburban backyard. I love the fact that you've got these different dives, swan layout, backward 1.5, and I think they have some kind of significance.
And they do. Well, but you know what? I mean, this is. I mean, in the end, it's like what I was talking about earlier, where you say, well, I mean, when we think about history, and this may be the case with any kind of history, or anybody's history. Most of us really do have such shallow and superficial kind of understandings of what these histories are. And we tend to take, we tend to only address the more sensational aspects of these histories. And or the parts that we like because they show us in the best light. But on a day-to-day basis, I mean, we are constantly struggling with how to come to terms with what the implications of the history that we are supposed to know mean for us. Because there's that phrase, for those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I mean, but that doesn't seem to encourage people to get deeper into really understanding what the histories are. And part of that has to do with the fact that there are multiple histories, even within an individual's life, there are multiple histories. And then your relation to the history has everything to do with the perspective from which you view it. But the reason why why I made those dives sort of concrete, is because I think, and that figure who's standing there on the diving board, I mean, she obviously seems a little apprehensive about taking the plunge.
He didn't.
He didn't. No, he was all in. But that's a part of what so each of those dives actually have something to do with the way we approach history, I think. And in particular, the way we think about African American history in the Western Hemisphere. And so I chose the swan dive because, the swan dive is a graceful, smooth, flat out, sort of no drama kind of approach to the thing. But a swan song is sort of your last shot at, some great opportunity or great achievement. A layout is the same kind of thing, where you just surrender to the force of nature. But the backwards 1.5, I think the implications of the idea of a backwards 1.5, especially as it goes to history, and in particular as it relates to the idea of African American history, and a notion that people might understand called Afrocentricity. There's a lot of writing about the idea and the implications of Afrocentricity, and a lot of people would describe Afrocentricity as a backwards 1.5.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because the idea of Afrocentricity in the first place is a reclamation project. It's the idea that if black folks in the Western Hemisphere and in America in particular could recover some of the lost grandeur, the lost glory, the lost autonomy, the lost creativity that was taken from people who were brought from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, then that a lot of the problems that African Americans experience here now could be resolved and overcome. That it's only by going back to something that was closer to what you came from that you could actually recenter yourself and become the fully realized and developed human being.
It's a kind of return.
So it's a return. It's a reclamation project. But the problem is that it's a replication. It's a return to things that you don't completely comprehend. You don't know the parameters of. You only know things that you've read about, for the most part.
And it's nostalgia.
And so it's nostalgic.
And nostalgia is a longing for a past that
probably didn't exist.
And it disallows you from living in the present.
Absolutely. And so that's why I say it's like a backwards 1.5. So that the implications of the idea of that word.
I get it now.
You get that.
And private, that word private on the fence, leads us to some of the other works, and fully into the suburban theme of Our Town and Bang. Two paintings, I liked them so much, and I recall discussing with you, Carrie, these are such great paintings, but they don't have any water in them, I said. And Carrie, who doesn't mince words, as you know, said, yes, there is. And there is, in fact, the pool in the back of Our Town and the water hose, vacuum cleaner, coming behind the little girl. And so this really did continue water into a different space, not just literally depictions of water, but the metaphor of water. How it courses out throughout many of your works. And I just wanted to put up some images of Bang, where Carrie is putting that revolutionary text.
Which is difficult to read at the top of that, but.
Yours is slightly different. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, and that's in these two doves are carrying that text. Below, we are one, alluding, of course, to the seal of the country. We are one. And, but yet, Carrie, you put these fascinating details into the painting. Beautiful drawings you'll see upstairs of children saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And the little girl, of course, has a diadem that makes her more than just a little girl.
But that sort of recalls the Delacroix painting, Liberty Leading the People, in a way.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, but she's running toward us, isn't she?
Well, in the Delacroix painting, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's still, it's the idea. So if I put the diadem on this figure, then it makes her like a statue,
Oh,
like a
right.
liberty figure. So then that, in some ways, relates to
Yes.
the Liberty Leading
Liberty
the People
is-
as a kind of as a part of a revolutionary act.
And
So-
liberty is gendered female.
As gendered female.
Yes.
Yep.
I got it. And then, of course, the water hose, alluding to that unfortunate incident, the Children's March in Birmingham in '63, where those big water hoses were used against the kids in the Civil Rights March by the fire department. And one of the fascinating biographical details of Kerry James is that you're born in Birmingham in 1955. And so you're 8 years old when that's happening in Kelly Ingram Park.
Yeah,
in
I'm 7 actually. I'll be
Okay.
8 in October.
Okay.
And that's, but
Well, then
Just
it's affecting you even
a
harder.
detail.
Yes. And then, of course, as some of you know, Kerry's family moves to LA, to Watts in '63. And so you're there for the riots in '65, and you also witnessed the Black Panthers in LA. So you're kind of this child Zelig of African American history.
I know it was the out of the frying pan into the fire kind of mode. It's like, I thought about that.
But that history is literally present, happening before your eyes when you're very young. Pretty interesting. And of course, in our town, you're Dick and Jane with Spot. You take that iconography from childhood books that some of us
Yeah.
grew up with. And we include some studies for this work. Kerry was going to have the children run away and then toward and then in front of the house. And the house changes. Here it's a snout house, contemporary suburban house. And then you decide on this white colonial. So here we're moving into a kind of contemporary or vaguely contemporary, mid-century, late 20th century contemporary world of African Americans achieving, if you will, the American dream. Sort of the antipode of the Middle Passage, sort of full enfranchisement, economic, political. But is it? Is our town our town? This, I have to say, is really such an affecting work. I'm wondering if you could tell us how you came up with this image that really endures. It's really a hard painting to forget. I think you achieved your goal in this painting.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. But
It's true.
well, I have to take James's word for it because because in a way it's like, being here in the first place is quite an achievement, I think.
Being
Yeah.
where?
Being here at the National Gallery.
Oh,
This is. And, it's one of those things where, to the degree that you can, and for me, and I think it will be relevant to the idea of this sort of middle-class aspirations. So there's an aspect of the way in which I see myself as a black man in America that is always saddled with a certain kind of doubt about your capacity to really achieve the kinds of successes that the quote-unquote American dream holds out as a promise to immigrants and anybody else who is able to come here. So there's, this comes from, these are some of this doubt is actually a consequence of having, probably just that little bit of knowledge of history that becomes dangerous to have. It's like you know just enough to get yourself in a lot of trouble and to be and to create some dissatisfaction in your perception of where you are. And so, I mean, so I am constantly reading and probing and getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the details of what these histories were like. And so this doubt. So if you understand that with the history of black folks in the United States has been a struggle to get the majority population in the country to acknowledge and recognize the promises that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and that it took 200 years, actually took 300 years for that to happen, but it took another 100 years after slavery was abolished, before the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1965, that there was somehow always going to be an obstacle or always going to be a barrier to achieving the kinds of success that were available to a lot of people in the country just as a matter of course. So as a black person, you can never really take anything for granted. And in part, you can't take that for granted because you are acutely aware of the fact that you are not in charge, that you are not controlling the access to opportunities or any of those things. And so on some level, you can never really trust or be sure that if you achieve something that seems sort of well articulated, masterfully done, you can't be sure, you can't take it for granted that it'll be recognized and acknowledged by the culture that has been denying you access to all those things for those 300 years. You can't take it for granted that that would be the case. I mean, and you see even now how servicemen who are receiving their medals of honor posthumously after having fought in World War I and World War II, when they weren't giving out those medals to black folks like they should have been giving them out. So, and then you see other aspects of the culture in which black people have done magnificent things but get no recognition for having achieved those things. So in an environment like that, you can't take anything for granted. And so I never took it for granted that I would ever be recognized for anything that I did, no matter how good it was that I was doing it. So I never assumed. And so the reason why I say that, it's like I never assumed I would ever be in a place like the National Gallery, even though it was what I aspired to achieve. And so my whole approach to making work has been to try and, at least to the degree that I could, structure the way I approach my paintings so that it would give me at least a 50-50 chance. And I mean a 50-50 chance by way of a kind of guarantee. A guarantee that I would be able to get where I wanted to go, but that guarantee had to be built on the fact that I would make myself as invulnerable to being dismissed as I possibly could.
And how does a painter do that?
Well, and the way that a painter does something like that is to always, it's to begin with the assumption that artists make work because other artists made work. And that if the history of, it's like if you come to the National Gallery or you go to the Metropolitan or you go to the Louvre or you go to Uffizi, you go to all of the great museums anywhere around the world. It doesn't take long to begin to piece together a series of principles that seem to be agreed upon by all of the people who operate those institutions and the artists who made work that ends up in there. And so if you look at those works, you start you can start to understand that there's a kind of frame of reference that everybody is using. And you have to make sure you understand that frame of reference.
And that can include the history of art, old masters, modernism. Your works have so many different sort of idioms all at once. All the abstract expressionist dripping and
so
realism and uses of greeting card cliches. You're sort of throwing a lot of things in the pot.
Right. Who was it? I was listening to a program on the radio just last week. There's a woman who wrote a book called 7 Days in the Art World, that talks about the way the art market works. And she quotes Roberta Smith in there. She says, Roberta Smith says, I throw a lot of words at the artwork and I see what sticks. I mean, in a way, I mean, it's not like I'm just throwing a lot of paint at the surface to see what sticks. But there's a way in which I'm trying to make sure that every picture I make, on some level, announces to the people who come to see it that it is hyper aware. It's aware of itself as being a part of a long history and tradition of the ways in which paintings can be made. And so from all the way from medieval painting, all the way up to the gestural stuff like Cy Twombly, that is the legacy of painting that you have to come to terms with and contend with anytime you make a picture. And the grace, I would say, with which you deploy all of that history on some level determines whether you have a shot at ending up in a place like the National Gallery at some point. And so I think I have to believe I have to believe I know what James knows. Because I have to know that it's going to be somebody like James who is deeply invested in the history of this art, who spends all of his time examining and trying to tease out the high points and the low points, the successes and failures. This is what he does. And so if I mean to have a conversation with James, or if I mean to put work in front of him of mine that I want him to look at and evaluate, I need to at least have a certain amount of confidence that when he looks at it, that he's going to see what I mean for him to see. And that he's going to understand the relationship between all of the parts and all of the things and their relationship to this history. So this is sort of the way I think about what I'm doing when I'm making it. And this is the thing that I think at least gives me a 50-50 chance.
And I think it makes your work meaningful for a museum like ours, a great museum that presents the history of art from 1200s Italy forward. And so when we look at your Nat Turner, one cannot but think of all the images we have of people fighting for their liberation, our Castagno, David and Goliath, this attributed to Mantegna, Judith and Holofernes. Suddenly your painting becomes legible within a history of art. Now, I should mention to everyone, the Nat Turner was Carrie's addition to the show. And I wanted a different note in the show, something else to refract or contradict or expand upon the rest of the show. So we had this wall, and Carrie proposed the Nat Turner with the head of his master, which I think is turning out to be one of the more striking things in the show. And I understand that your wife Cheryl doesn't particularly like it. Is that?
No, I don't know if she will let you speak for yourself.
Okay. But anyway,
No.
Nat Turner, you've done images of Nat Turner, and why did you want this in the show? Why was it so important to you to have it in this show?
Well, I mean, there are two reasons. I think one of it, it's the most recent painting I've done that's a part of the group. I mean, the other works go back 20 years and more, and so this is actually a fairly current image. But I think because the collection of works overall embodies a kind of ambivalence towards the American dream and the American ideal that I think is kind of endemic to huge parts of the African American population. That's the ambivalence, that's the doubt, and that's a certain unease at feeling fully invested and fully a part of the American project. The Nat Turner painting really, it's on in part a way of establishing a certain kind of parody, I would say. With the paintings like the Judith and Holofernes painting and the David and Goliath painting, because it addresses the idea of heroism And who gets to pick your heroes? And so that, and who has the capacity and the right to exercise their struggle for freedom, and under what terms? So if you take the Nat Turner image and the Judith, the Holofernes image, and or all of the David and Goliath figures, that we are familiar with those kinds of images. And so nobody seems to have a problem with the fact that under the circumstances that those images and those narratives were constructed, that the individuals who committed these acts, these beheadings and stuff, they had every right to, and it's a legitimate action in the service of the struggle that they were engaged in. But somehow or other, when it comes to black folks in America asserting that same kind of right, nobody seems to have a space to understand that that the killing of his master is also a legitimate action under the circumstances that Nat Turner was living at the time. So if your life is completely controlled and circumscribed by people who have more power than you, and who can buy and sell you at will, who can beat you when they want to, and not only could your master beat you, but under the laws of slavery at the time, any white person in the country could beat you on sight if they wanted to, and you had no recourse, then to me, the rebellion that Nat Turner sponsored is as legitimate a right as anybody else's right to do whatever it takes to get to the outcome that you feel is due you. And so that's why I make the Nat Turner paintings. So you can't deny to just black people, in a way, the right to have to be invested in people who, and to describe those acts as heroic as we describe the act of Judith as heroic. My thing is that you can't deny that right to black folks, and that I'm perfectly capable of selecting my heroes from the historical record and amplifying the actions they took, just like anybody else should be perfectly capable and have a right to do those things. So that's in part why I do it that way. And then the other part of it is that the fact that slave rebellions occurred, and then there was a fear of slave rebellions occurring, was a constant presence in the minds of people, white Americans and slave owners over the centuries. And that the only way you could continually suppress the capacity to revolt like that was for the system to become more and more and more brutal. And so that Nat Turner was as much responsible for the ending of slavery as any abolitionist group would have been responsible for the ending of slavery, because over time the pressure and then the fear of slave revolts had a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people at some point got to the point where this, like, you can't keep going on like this. It just can't keep going like this. So anyway.
And the show is structured, as you'll see, this is the plan to sort of establish these sorts of connections, what you're saying, a kind of parody. Because in the main gallery, as you walk back in, are the two founding fathers who were great voices of liberty and freedom and began the country and wrote the founding documents on their estates on Monticello and Mount Vernon. And I just wanted to let everyone know the context for those paintings. They are maquettes or models for these frescoes that Kerry James made in San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which I guess have been painted over, yeah? So
well, those walls have been torn down now. So.
Okay, even worse. So, but we have the two paintings, and they're so remarkable. And so we've kind of rejoined them here in the National Gallery. And I just want to point out Kerry's command of art history, that these paintings have what we call anamorphic figures, and anamorphosis is a distortion of a form. And we have the most famous example of it is, of course, the Ambassadors by Holbein, of the skull that's sort of tilted, and if you walk to the side, it comes into a whole image. And it's, of course, a Vanitas painting, a reminder of death, that these young and successful men are standing next to. And Kerry James enlists anamorphosis and also a kind of exaggeration of the heads, in part because you wanted a viewer to look up from above. Is that true?
To look up from below.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if that atrium space in San Francisco was a challenging space. I mean, it's really an awkward place to try and work, because there's no vantage point from the side or from an angle where you could create the anamorphic image and then make it work. Because of the way the atrium was structured. So the only way you could do it was to create it so that the anamorphosis came together from standing directly below the figure of each of the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. But a part of what I was trying to also suggest with those works, and with the distortion you see in them when you're looking at them head on, is that a lot of the way in which we think about these figures historically is a distortion. I mean, they are fundamentally distorted because there are so many things and so many aspects of who they are and what they were about that we tend to overlook and we tend to dismiss or not even bring up. And so taking that as a point of departure, there was no angle from which you could see them in which they would be sort of whole, except if you were underfoot.
And last but not least, final question. You paint people of African descent almost exclusively. Occasional white figures come up, as we've seen, quite meaningfully. But there's a history of art, of course, and much has been written about the representation of Africans, people of African descent. Here are some paintings, very famous ones in the gallery. Watson and the Shark, and the Van Dyke, each of their period. And here you are in the 2000s, alluding, of course, to previous representations of Africans. In Gulf Stream, one of the paintings upstairs, alluding to the famous Winslow Homer, Gulf Stream. And people have remarked again and again that not only do you paint Africans or people of African descent, and you paint them extremely black again and again and again, and that has all kinds of meanings and implications in terms of depiction, that a lack of modeling, a kind of flattening effect, perhaps in a modernist way. It has other meanings for you. I think it's caused a bit of controversy in your work at times. Mm-hmm. Some viewers wonder about why always this almost monocolor. Mm-hmm. Not just that you paint mostly Africans, but this mono-blackness as the kind of schemata mm-hmm. for your work. We know in 6th century Greek vase painting, that's a system of black figures on vases. But in your work, of course, it has a very different meaning. And I raise it in part in respect to this work we own by Byron Kim, Synecdoche, where a contemporary of yours wants to, if you will, deconstruct the question of color, of skin tone. Each of these paintings referring to an individual, the skin tone translated onto a canvas. For Byron Kim's work, there is no skin tone. He is challenging race and skin tone as a kind of unary idea. You enlist it again and again, and I'm wondering if you might talk about that.
Well, when I began using that black color to depict figures, I mean, it started out, I used it, and it's a rhetorical device. So that when we talk about, you can take black studies, black history, black studies, black culture, black music, So rhetorically, we tend to use that designation to describe people, in spite of the fact that, as people are always willing to point out, well, black people come in a lot of different colors. But they all operate under the umbrella, culturally and historically, of being black people. So that's the first principle. I mean, it's a rhetorical device. But it's a rhetorical device in which I think you sort of gather and are able to project the most power and the most presence. Because that extremeness of the color is arresting, I think. I mean, it definitely calls attention to itself. And since what artists are doing, what you're trying to do in the first place is to to attract the attention of a viewer to a work, this is one of the things I think does that quite effectively. So in that regard, that's it. The other is that I use the blackness as a kind of extreme, because I mean, historically, being black has been stigmatized in the United States in particular, and in parts of the Western Hemisphere as well. So there have alternately been periods and phases in history where black people have been fleeing from the idea of being called black or represented as black or identified as black. And then in the 60s, during the civil rights struggle, and then in particular the black liberation struggle, this notion that black is beautiful as a kind of corrective, a kind of counteractive to the notion that black is somehow ugly, not beautiful, and somehow debased. The whole idea of black is beautiful is a way of sort of contradicting that. And so a part of the reason I use it is also in that regard, as a way of asserting a kind of complexity and a kind of beauty, even as the color seems to be a reduction. It still is a way of amplifying the fact that within that range of color, there's a lot of variety that can take place. And in that variety, you can actually find real, genuine beauty there as well. So that's why I paint the figures black. The other thing is that I've always, I make a lot of work that wrestles with the idea of presence and absence, visibility and invisibility. And so when I first started these images, I was painting black figures against black backgrounds. So where is this question of being and not being, being present and being absent simultaneously was something that was important to me. And it was something that I thought was amplified really well in Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, if you read the prologue, in which he describes the condition of invisibility not as not being there, but as not being seen as a psychological kind of people who are crippled psychologically. There's an inability to see people, even if they're standing right in front of you. And so all of those things sort of come into play when I'm making this image. But the thing is, I really do want to assert a kind of fundamental primacy of the idea of being black in a variety of different contexts, and being powerfully black in such a way that fact of the existence of those figures can never be overlooked, and it can never be dismissed, and it can never be minimized by resorting to this sort of full panoply of tonal values and ranges that black people might come in. Now, the other part of that, though, and I think one of the things that the Byron Kim piece kind of points to is that, I mean, on some level, you can argue that a good part of that range of tonalities that people say still can refer to black is something that was imposed on black people by white supremacy. So,
what do you mean by that?
Well, so you can have in the 18th century, as slavery as a system was really becoming codified and formulating all of the laws and the restrictions that were going to designate black folks as fundamentally slave-worthy, this notion of who could be white was something that was set down in law. And there's a thing that people might know of called the one-drop rule, that any person that had any distant relationship to black people, no matter how small, even if it was one drop in the blood, had to be considered black, that they couldn't be white. And so, and by being black, were then available for enslavement. So you can have, as the Thomas Jefferson story, I think, really fully illustrates, the figure of Sally Hemings, who, being described by visitors who would come to Monticello, said, well, she looked about as white as any white woman I ever saw. Now, how is it that a woman looking like that would also be a black woman? And that's because this notion that the status of the figure follows the status of the mother. And that law was set up because we know a lot of white men were having babies, were impregnating a lot of black women who couldn't resist or couldn't do anything about it, and they were producing offspring. And on the English law, those children who were born out of that union followed the status of the father and therefore would be free. So the law was changed so that the child follows the status of the mother, because it was always assumed that the mother would be the slave. And even if the father, who was the master, was a white man who would father the children. So those children followed the status of the mother, which meant that you could essentially increase your slave holdings by impregnating the slave women that were on your plantation. So that's what that's how the law is articulated. And Thomas Jefferson actually, in a letter that is really, that you can find online, did an interview with a Frenchman, I think it was, who would come to Monticello. They were talking about the way in which the laws in slavery in Virginia defined what a mulatto was. And in the conversation, apparently, he made some comments about how the definition of a mulatto was expressed, to which he understood he had made a mistake or left the wrong impression. So he writes a letter to this man and really outlines how you understand what a mulatto was and what the condition of being black or being white really is. And he goes through detail. He says it's simply a mathematical equation. That if you look at the line of descent through mixtures of all of these different people, that mathematically you would end up at a point in which, as he says, if you take a black person and cross them with a white, you end up with a mulatto. And then if you take that person and cross them with another white, you end up with another mixture. And then he goes on down the line and he says after the third cross, you can clear the blood of the black quality, and that person could become a free white man, and by all intents and purposes, a citizen of the United States. He says, but that doesn't, he sort of said, but he does say at one point, but through that whole equation, that even if the child was a child of the mother, because the descent follows the line of the mother, that even if that person ended up looking really white, that wouldn't that wouldn't set him free, because his condition follows the status of the mother. So, I mean, there was this whole complicated idea about who could be black and who was black and who could be white, but it was really a system that structured whiteness as the privileged position to be in. So blackness, under every circumstances, was always seen as a kind of a contamination. And so if I take operating in this moment, sort of using this blackness as a kind of fundamental, kind of quintessential emblem of being, I mean, it in part it's a challenge to this notion that there's something degraded about the totality or the depth of that kind of blackness.
And so you're going to make an art about it.
So I'm making art about it.
So I think we have probably run out of time. Is that correct? We have. So, unfortunately, because I know everyone has lots of questions, but we've gotten to hear from Carrie fully about the show. Thank you so much for coming.